the Reverend Bob Schenck, author of Costly Grace. You have a book. You and the Reverend Barry W. Lynn were on opposing sides
completely
of the social issues facing the Supreme Court.
Diametric opposites.
Diametrically. So if the Reverend Barry W. Lynn was in favor of abortion, you would be
completely contrary to that. I was for.
Right. If the Reverend Barry W. Lynn was for same-sex marriage, you would be opposed to.
Yes, not necessarily because he was for, I'd be against, but I didn't mind kind of playing that role to its max.
Okay. And so you would argue and appear on Crossfire, and you were okay.
Yep.
Great.
A lot of those.
Okay. You know what? This is fast. I'm going to disappear because I want to hear this. This is fascinating.
The big changes started to come, as I understood the trajectory of your life, not over abortion, gay rights, separation of church and state, but over guns. When you met Abigail Disney, a philanthropist, and what did she ask you?
Yeah, she asked me point blank, pun intended, how can you be pro-life and pro-gun? And she was referring to my evangelical community. I'm an evangelical minister, and white evangelicals in the United States are one of the subgroups in the American population to embrace gun rights as unfettered, Second Amendment without any restrictions, any limitations. And they are also one of the groups most likely to either own lethal firearms or have immediate access to them. So that was a surprise to me when she announced that. Of course, I saw guns in a lot of places, including churches in those days. But it surprised me, and she dared me to take on the question why that was true. It took me a while to say yes, because as I tested the question in my own community, I learned that I was putting my career, my calling as a minister at risk, because I was, I would be ostracized if I took an opposite position to the communities. I would be banned and banished, and eventually I was. But that was the question that started pulling at the thread.
And she made a documentary about you and the gun rights claims, and people can still get that, see that.
Yes, it's an Emmy Award-winning feature-length documentary called The Armor of Light. It's really not entirely my story. It's also Lucy McBath's story, who is in Congress now. But when I met her, she was a flight attendant who had lost her son to an obscene act of gun violence. Her 17-year-old boy, who was playing his music a bit too loud, he being African-American, he was with 4 other Black teenage males in a car. They were all playing their music and enjoying it when a white contractor of some sort, I guess he was a building contractor, drove up, told them to turn the music down. They said, "Why don't you roll your window up?" And with that, he let loose a volley of 9mm bullets into the car that killed young Jordan Davis and took Lucy's only child from her. And that was life-altering to meet her. And by the way, she identified as an evangelical, Bible-believing, born-again, spirit-filled Christian. You know what all these terms mean. A lot of people don't, but let's just say she was just like me, except she was Black and a woman.
And two distinctions.
And she had her head on straight about things that I didn't.
There are people who quote the Bible to justify. In fact, there was a church in Pennsylvania a couple of years ago that had a dual service one Saturday, a reaffirmation of your marriage vows and a blessing of your AR-15 assault rifles. And when asked, what's the Bible say about it? They quoted from the book of Revelation. We had a little discussion of Revelation earlier. The rod of iron, that one phrase justified in the minds of these, fundamentalist, which you are not, a fundamentalist Christian church, justified possession of one of the most deadly weapons you can find in this country. Was it also something you notice within the so-called abortion, the anti-abortion movement? Were there people there lining up, carrying weapons? And what did you think of that at the time, even before you were a part of this documentary? What were they like? What were there guns in the possession of people who wanted to shoot abortion providers if it came to that?
Well, I didn't think I knew any. We knew they existed for sure, and the folks joining tonight may already know that I had a prominent position in the national anti-abortion movement. It would fly under different flags. The one that was specific to me was Western New York Rescue, a part of the National Rescue Operation Rescue Network. And I didn't think I knew anyone like that. But then oddly, over time, some of the male leaders, and there were plenty of women in the early days of that movement, but they gradually disappeared. They were muscled out by the male leadership. And some of those male leaders started showing up first with empty holsters on their belts because they were worried that they were going to be arrested and charged with something related. So they would just have the empty holster as a show of, machismo.
Sure.
Or something, sure. Pretending to be that. And then I heard talk that some of them had weapons in their cars, glove compartments behind the back seat of their now red pickup truck. And it was a transformation that took place over about a 10-year period until finally, yes, some of them told me that they would never be separated from their firearm, that it was always with them. Now, none of them committed, the ones I'm talking about did not commit any blatant acts of gun violence against anyone, but there were, of course, shooters in our movement. And that was disorienting to me, but not enough that I didn't learn how to compartmentalize it, put that box on a shelf and say, I'll come back and visit that at another time.
When you talk about compartmentalizing things, but one thing that you never compartmentalize is the fact that you do identify and still identify as an evangelical Christian.
I do.
And when it comes to the problem with many of the people in that movement, including Randall Terry, who started Operation Rescue that you just mentioned, Falwell, Pat Robertson. I mean, I knew all these people quite well.
Yeah, I know you did.
And but they could not stop merging their theological understanding with their political agenda. It was one and the same. And you have gradually been extracting yourself from making that comparison. How difficult is it, though, when there is an issue like choice, reproductive choice, to move away from what is a core issue? I mean, I think I could be wrong, but I think that the so-called members of the religious right, they're more concerned about abortion than they are about guns, maybe a close call. When you start to separate that, was there one moment when you said, wait a minute, I think I may be wrong about this? Bill Baird, who was my guest last week, had that a terrible story when he was at Harlem Hospital and found an African-American woman in the halls, bleeding all over from her efforts to do an abortion, self-abortion, with a coat hanger. Was there anything like that when you started to say, wait, I could be really, really wrong?
Yes. Yes,
What
there
was
was. Now I'm going to say that the ground, the hardened ground of my mind was softened already by reading the work of a young, brilliant, dead German pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was one of the first Protestant leaders in Germany to stand up against Hitler's racialized dictatorship, would pay for that with his life when he was hanged by the Nazis at age 39. But he left behind a wonderful body of literature. I know you're very familiar with Bonhoeffer, Barry, and many people are, because they encountered him in college reading or whatever.
Sure.
And he dealt with ethics. He was really an ethicist more than he was anything else. He was many things, but he was in his writings an ethicist. And so I had started reading him, and that was kind of shaking things up. And I was realizing that I had separated myself from the reality of people's lives and their suffering. My cohorts and I had created a fictional world. We had developed a highly complex fantasy. And in that fantasy, every pregnancy involved a child whom someone wanted desperately, that any mother should want. And there was plenty of support for anyone in crisis pregnancy. There were people ready to pay their medical bills, ready to offer them free childcare, ready to give them a job, ready to pay their kids' college tuition. Whatever it was there. Why would anyone want to have an abortion when you have all those support systems? But what we had in our heads was a fantasy about, first of all, a young white woman living in a middle to upper middle class community, likely part of a church family where everybody was ready to just marshal whatever was required, including adoption, to ensure that child had everything, well, the mother and child had everything they needed. That was not reality.
Of course not.
And it took a really jarring experience when I was in Alabama. And I was jailed many times for my protest work, pro-life, anti-abortion, and otherwise. I was in jail. I was in the Montgomery County Jail, and they threw me in the psychiatric wing, which many people found appropriate. I didn't, but they did. And it was co-ed. There were men and women on that wing of this really miserable jail. And there was a woman about 3 doors from my cell who was suffering some form of mental illness. Black woman, very poorly clad, very unkempt. Her skin, I remember, had lesions and infection, and she was just screaming and saying, I have 3 babies. I have 3 babies. Who has my babies? Who's taking care of my babies? Who's looking? And suddenly, Barry, that was like an intervention that shattered these defensive walls of fantasy that I had built up over years. And suddenly I saw this woman was not white. She was not middle class or upper. She didn't have support systems. Nobody cared about her. And nobody in the jail cared whether she had childcare or not. Nobody cared about her. And that was a real reality check for me. Unfortunately, it would take years more for that to take effect in my heart and mind, but it would never leave me.
When was it that you actually started publicly to say, I was wrong to be a part of this reproductive choice movement. I was wrong. I got it wrong. I didn't see things. When's the first time you ever said that publicly?
Well, I guess it was somewhere around 2012 when we were shooting the film The Armor of Light. And Abby Disney, who, by the way, I must say, is not, the heiress people think, okay.
Right.
She is a very smart, very engaged, successful businesswoman. She is a philanthropist, world-class philanthropist. Anyone in the women's rights movement, anyone in reproductive rights movement, anyone in the arts knows how much she does with her wealth for all those causes and a lot more. And she's an award-winning filmmaker. So we were doing something somewhere and she just said, I need to ask you a question. And then she told me her own abortion story, which went to her years when she was in college. I think she was 21, 22, something like that. And she said, had you been in exactly my frame of mind, in my circumstances, in the situation I was in my relationship with the man who was, was my intimate partner, what would you have done? And she said, don't you give me one of your movement slogans. Don't you give me one of your bumper sticker sayings. You tell me what you would have done. And until you can tell me that, I don't want to hear anything else. You tell me what you would have done. Now, okay, I'm bearing all with you, Barry, because I trust you. You are my confessor. You are a pastoral figure to me now. And so I will just say, I was in therapy by then.
Yeah.
And I had a therapist who was really helping me face the truth about myself. And so it was the right time to ask me that question. And I sat on it a little bit. And finally, I told Abby, I would have done the same thing you did. I would have had an abortion.
Yeah.
Well, to some, that may seem like, stupid guy. But for me, it was a tectonic shift in the way I saw the universe, the way I saw God, the way I saw me and everyone around me.
When you have these seismic changes in personality, when anybody goes through this, you still maintain a core that never leaves you. And I think, many of the people who listen to this show are atheists, and they would say, but how can you possibly maintain your belief in God when you are having these own doubts about your original understanding of the connection between God and some of these issues, not just guns, not just abortion rights, but also gay people, the LGBTQ community, separation of church and state. How can you change so dramatically in so many? We're going to get into some of these other changes, but how can you do that and still maintain the core belief that you learned in part from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whose Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute you've created here in Washington, D.C.?
Wow, I wish I had a pithy answer to that. I don't, except to say, there was a long period of time when I replaced my core belief in God with a highly politicized being. I say I had 3 conversions in my life. The first conversion was from the nominal Judaism of my youth to born-again Christianity. I was 16 years old. And it was sincere and it was life-changing. Then came another conversion. From that, the Jesus who blessed the poor, who cared for the suffering, who blessed peacemakers, was against conflict and war. And I was converted to Ronald Reagan Republican religion, which I've since learned is distinctly different from Christianity. And I would spend 5 years in that, wandering in that desert. And there were times when I wasn't sure of the difference between Jesus and Ronald Reagan, or someone like him. And it took coming back in a really radical conversion to that first Jesus who challenged me. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, Jesus was the consummate one for others, not for himself, not to justify himself, but for the other. And so I guess it was really a kind of reconversion to a renewed or even new faith. That's the best I can do with it. I can't.
And I think people need to understand that when you were in those 30 plus years of being tied very clearly to Republican politicians, I mean, you were their minister. You didn't just send them $10 a month. I mean, you were praying with them. You were ministering to them here in Washington on a regular basis. And you had certainly flirtations with even Jerry Falwell, who's, I understand his fundraiser was hoping to gain you into the clutches of that money machine that Falwell was creating. When you change these issues, do you ever go back to some of these senators, for example, many of whom are still around, and explain this shift to them? Because they could actually do something about correcting the error of their ways, which I guarantee you in almost every case is attributed to their claimed profession for the love of Jesus.
Well, one of the things I've resolved these days is to do more truth telling than I did in the past. And so truthfully, I've just now, 10 years into this new odyssey, I've just now started to reach back here and there. Some of them have reached out to me. Some of them just because they say, I can't believe what's going on with you. Did you lose your mind? Did you have some kind of nervous breakdown? What happened to you, Shank? And so I give an answer the best way that I can. And I would hope that could be salutary. I've also given up on blithe optimism, and I've tried to be a little more realistic about hopefulness. But I spend much more time with younger, aspiring leaders, both in the church and outside the church, and even in the public sector, to talk about how to avoid this kind of political co-optation that I've seen take possession, almost like a demonic possession. I'm going to get that weird.
Exactly.
Because with the with Trumpianism, what I call the Trump heresy within the evangelical church, it is so inexplicable at times that it does appear almost supernatural. But now I'm getting out in the outer limits here, so I'll come back.
Well, one of the things I want people to understand is that when you turned your back on the anti-abortion movement, when you started to embrace, and as I understand, even hire at least one member of the LGBT community, and then in the last election cycle, you did the unthinkable. You told people to vote for Joe Biden over Donald Trump. So I would imagine, I'm speculating here, but that's what we do in the media, don't we? That there were people who said, okay, so Rob's, he's changed his mind on this issue, maybe, but surely he wouldn't endorse voting for Joe Biden. But you did it very publicly. You voted for him. You put it on Facebook. You put it up on social media. And then I imagine the blowback got even worse, because now you weren't just changing your mind about an issue. You were taking a person who literally is viewed in a godlike manner by so many, what I would call evangelical fundamentalists. What happened to you then? Yeah,
well, I lost a whole bevy of people whom I I thought were friends, or at least collegially friendly. But I was called everything except the Antichrist, although I was told that I was cooperating with Satan for the destruction of the gospel and that I was now a certified baby murderer. I had lost my soul. Actually, Barry, I think I probably could have retained some of those people if I had renounced Jesus Christ, but not Donald Trump.
Right. One of the things that, just as an aside, a reporter once asked Jerry Falwell if he thought that I was the Antichrist. And he said, no, because the Antichrist must be Jewish. And I don't think Barry is. So just a little tidbit. When
you know, my father was Jewish, my mother was Christian and converted to Judaism to marry my father. So they might have a closer call with me on that one. I don't know.
Well, you unfortunately
just
can't
add the anti-Semitism to it.
Exactly. If people go to your website and they look at your blog, these are some of the headlines on recent blog entries. White American evangelicals are the new snake handlers, only more dangerous. How about this one? No apology for comparing Trump to Hitler. I would never. I think once I actually referred to people on the conservative evangelical front as snake handlers, and my very highly qualified communications people said, "Don't ever do that again," and I never did that again. But here you are using this language, comparing Trump to Hitler. Why the powerful words? Why not just say, okay, he's a bad guy, or Hitler? Well, I believe that, by the way. I believe that if you put a list of the four biggest despots in modern history, it is Stalin, it is Hitler, it is Pol Pot, and it is Donald Trump. But that's me. When you say it, it carries a whole different meaning.
Well, you know, one is, of course, I'm an evangelical and I'm speaking to my fellow evangelicals. You know, the Deutsche Evangelische Kirche, the Evangelical Church of Germany, in 1933 declared Adolf Hitler a gift and miracle from God. And that's where I go to, is the error is made as much on the side of the worshiper of Trump as in Trump himself. And so for me, this is the same egregious error that was made by Protestant evangelicals in Germany in late 1920s up to the 1940s. It's a replay. And yes, there's no genocidal machine going, or wasn't under Trump or under the MAGA movement right now. But neither was that true of the Nazi movement when Hitler first came to power. It was giving Hitler and his minions the right atmosphere, the right authority, and so forth to commit those atrocities. So, what phase of Hitler's despicable existence are we talking about? Mine, I would peg it at 1933.
Yeah. There was a group, I got involved at the tail end of it. They produced a film and a book called Theologians Under Hitler. And it was an effort because there'd been a lot of writing about how the Roman Catholic Church had kind of caved in, and the understanding of a lot of the German people, we lost in World War I. We don't care who brings us back, but we want to be proud one more time. And a lot of theologians, of course, Protestant theologians, did the same thing, as you just pointed out. What?
I've just got to make a note that Steve Martin, who made that film, Theologians Under Hitler, based on Bob Erickson's, the scholar Bob Erickson's work, is now the secretary of my board. So
Terrific.
I'm trying to keep good company.
It's very good company. It's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, on the other hand, even if people read him in college or think they've heard of him, they probably think that he unequivocally was involved in that July 20th, 1944 effort to assassinate Hitler. And this was an effort, a failed effort. A bomb had been placed in a briefcase. A briefcase was on a table in a room where Hitler was sitting with a number of other people. And it went off and he was injured, but it wasn't killed. Now, there is some scholarly question about what role Bonhoeffer may have actually played in the planning of that. Tell us what that means. I mean, tell us what you think the historical truth is. And then also, how do you reach a point? I mean, I am not a pacifist. I'm just the closest thing most people have ever come to finding one. But here was a man who preached and found a biblical reason to be a pacifist. What role, if any, did he play in that assassination attempt?
Yeah, I think it was peripheral. He seemed to be an advisor on the morality and ethics of tyrannicide. But he did identify with the movement that would eventually make attempts on Hitler's life. He writes about it between the lines in his magnum opus, Ethics, which I challenge anyone to read. It's really a mind expander. But long story short is whether he did or didn't, and Professor Mark Thiessen Nation makes a pretty good defense that he wasn't embracing the actual act of assassination. But I'm not sure. I favor that he was, but in an entirely unique way. He said basically it was an unrepeatable act, unique to that circumstance, unique to that moment, unique to that tyrant, Hitler, and was not a model for anything anywhere. And then, in fact, he was risking his own soul in even being identified with that movement. So it's nuanced. It's not simple. It's anything but simplistic.
When you come through this journey and you look at what could be done now, obviously, and I frequently blame Democrats for lots of things, and including on this program. But you enticed me into doing something when we were still on the opposite sides of things. When the Monica Lewinsky story broke, you called me and you said you were doing a thing that was going to be aired on C-SPAN with a lot of pastors, but you didn't have any progressive pastors. Would I come and do it? And I said I would, and I was glad I did. But I'll tell you, in a small way, because it didn't get huge amounts of attention, I got more hate mail from participating in that than I've done in anything else I've ever done in my entire life. But it was the right thing to do, because you cannot look at what happened with Bill Clinton and say, oh, she seduced him. He's a grown-up. You can't allow that kind of conduct. You cannot excuse him for not being literally the grown-up in the room and resisting that. And even Hillary, at one point, I think right after her loss in the campaign, accused Monica Lewinsky of being a seductress. If you're right, you're right. If you're wrong, you're wrong. And it's amazing, I think, for many people to realize how much you have suffered from acknowledging that you really got it wrong for 35 years. I commend you for that. And I mean, there are people in the chat, which I'm not supposed to be reading, but are commending you for the same thing. And I think in this movement, there were people that you are unique in my experience because you always seem to be a person who cared deeply about people. You cared about what they were thinking. You cared about what I had no idea that I was having any influence on you at all. But I'm glad to hear that. But I also think that talking to Jerry Falwell, talking with Pat Robertson, talking with Lou Sheldon and the other luminaries of the right at the time, I never sensed that they had any humanity. They had talking points. They were reciting the bumper stickers, but I didn't think they really cared about people. And so many of the politicians, including some Democrats today, who talk about women's rights and being pro-choice, they don't spend 5 minutes of extra time trying to make that a reality. So they put up bills like yesterday's, doesn't even get a majority vote. And they know, and they knew it wouldn't. And now they're all crowing about what a wonderful thing. Kristen Sinema, a Democratic in name only senator from Arizona, was out today explaining how she voted to protect the lives of women. She, of course, could have cast a vote to do away with the filibuster, and then it would have meant something. But her vote yesterday is literally meaningless.
Well, Barry, may I use this opportunity first just to say I always saw you as a person of integrity, always felt you were the real thing, genuine. It helped. It gave me pause on some of my ill-formed opinions on many things. But the other thing I want to do is publicly apologize to you, because there were many times when I was rude, when I gave you a hard time simply to give you a hard time, but at night wondered whether you were the one on the right side of the equation. And I never thanked you for that. So I'm thanking you for it now and begging your pardon for the bad times. But I'm glad to be in your company now. I'm sure glad you survived your life-threatening moment. That was when you told me that story. I'm just thankful to still have you here so that we can spend a few more years. I'm very aware that I did a lot of damage during those 30 years, a lot of damage. And many people remained very mad at me for that. And I understand their anger. So maybe I can collaborate with you in doing a little more of that repair work.
Well, I really appreciate that. And of course, I accept your apologies and wasn't even looking for them, but
I know.
I understand that. David has rejoined us. David, do you have any final questions or comments you'd like to pose here?
Yes. This was an amazing interview. I'm kind of speechless. This has been a beautiful, beautiful conversation, just perfectly beautiful. I don't know if I can even come close to doing justice to it. Let me revisit your third conversion. That would be turning your back on Trump and the Right to Life movement. Changing people's minds. What changed your mind most? Conversations with Reverend Barry W. Lynn, arguing the world, or experiencing the world?
Experiencing it,
Yeah.
David, experiencing it. Again, taking down the walls, those artificial sceneries that I had built, the fantastical landscape that I had built, and facing the real world, real people, their real lives, the real reasons they made their decisions, not the reasons I imagined them, to have, but that they really had. And that was not an easy thing. And it took a lot of work. But but it was really facing the reality of people's lives. What I say now is that I spent an awful lot of time demanding that other people join me and live in my non-reality. And now I understand that the challenge in front of me is to live with them in their reality. And that was it was a seismic change in the way I structured my life and the way I related to other people. So that's really the short answer.
What advice could you give to our side? And unfortunately, there are two sides. What advice is there to win over more people like you, or do we just have to depend on life itself, experience? Is there anything we can do to bring people to our side?
I think first we have to be careful not to immediately go to contempt in our.
That's my default position.
What's that?
My default position is contempt. Contempt for the other side, and even more contempt for my side. So it's.
But you have developed it into a beautiful art form. Which allows you to get away with that. Some people are just so ham-handed and clumsy and ugly about it.
Right.
But you do it exquisitely. I've watched you. Yeah, I think that's part of it. You know, one of the stories I love to tell is about the most Trumpian financial benefactor that I had in my old world, who had a gun collection. I don't even know how many guns he owned. I want to put it in several hundred. And he always said, I have one at easy reach wherever I am. He was that kind of guy. He was more Republican than any Republican you've ever met. And yet I met Don on the southern border when he and his wife were sweating in the kitchen of a ramshackle little church filled with immigrant pastors, many of whom we all knew were undocumented, who, were, we used to call them illegal in that church. And yet Don and his wife were cooking 3 meals a day. They were very wealthy, lived in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, Siesta Key, Florida, and Dayton, Ohio, depending upon the season of the year. And yet they were there serving these folks for a whole week, didn't have to, were giving themselves. They were people of very mixed motive. And when COVID came around, he wasn't going to let anybody tell him what to do, and he didn't wear a mask, and he died. And that still chokes me up because I loved this man. And as complicated and problematic as he was, and when I turned on Donald Trump, I'm sure he thought I was the Antichrist. And yet, human beings are complex. They're a mix of everything, sometimes a mix of a lot more bad than good. And maybe Don got that way, and maybe I did too. But I think we have to, show people the same honor we want to be shown, and yet challenge them, because that's part of doing good, is to help somebody like me reassess my opinions. So I'm not talking about, being mealy-mouthed and silent. You let them have it. You do that masterfully, Mr. Feldman. So does Barry.
Please
masterfully.
Call me Reverend Feldman, please.
There you go.
Mr. Feldman's my father. Thank you.
That's the best I can do.
I would like to repeat this as much as possible. This is between you and Reverend Barry W. Lynn. I have so many questions that I wanted to ask you. The people who don't agree with us, I've got it in my head that most of the people who don't agree with me don't believe what they're saying. They're just trying to irritate me, own me. Owning a lib is the new expression. Try to get a rise out of me. And if they do believe what they're saying, there's something deeply, deeply wrong with them psychologically. But when you describe your friend Don serving undocumented Americans in the heat, he believes, you're saying he believed that he was on the right side. There was nothing fraudulent about it.
No, but there were moments that we had. Let me give you an example. We were talking about LGBTQ folk, and he would slip into the ugly use of the F word for male, for gay men. And I'd say, hey, too far, Don, too far. And then he'd say, don't get me wrong. Let me tell you something. I die for my cook. The guy who cooks for me, we lavish him. We take care of him. We love him. He's as gay as you get. I love him. I knew national evangelical leaders. Barry, you would know every one of them.
Yeah.
At least a couple who went to the same-sex weddings of their children's friends and celebrated, danced, yucked it up, had a great time, never said a disparaging word, celebrated those marriages in that moment. Then sadly would return home only to write the most vitriolic, disparaging, insulting, missives that would go out, because that was their job. That was the business end of it. And for a lot of them, that's all that it was. It was a business, and you had to bring in the bucks. And there's a big difference. If you got on anti-same-sex marriage, anti-abortion, anti-feminism, you could bring in $100 million a year on that.
You just write that down. Hang on for it.
He's attempting to develop a theology for the Church of Feldman.
I don't want to be a part of that.
Anti-feminism? I could do that. I could $100 million. And do I get to
$100 million?
All tax-free. I've told you this many times, David.
Right.
Hey, let me ask you one thing, because I know we got to wrap this up. But when I interviewed Randall Terry, who, just for remind people, he was really the most formidable creator of Operation Rescue, the most well-known person. And you worked with them and him on a number of occasions. But when he had a little problem in the church that he was a member, he had an affair and was with another woman. And when that news broke, I called him up, and I had him on a radio show I was doing at the time. And I said, Randall, for somebody who can find opposition to abortion in the Bible, which I could never find, but I said, it's unequivocal. You divorce. How do you mix you getting a divorce with the clear statement in the Bible that you shouldn't have one? And he said to me, well, Barry, we're all human. We're all human. And in that one moment, I thought, well, he's told the truth, but he's also explained why he's wrong about almost everything, because we are humans.
Well said. Well said.
Why don't we do this real soon? This was one of the I have to say this, and I'm looking at the chat room on YouTube and on Zoom. This is one of the most profound conversations we've had on this show. And I thank you, Reverend Bob Schenck. And your book is Costly Grace. How do we buy that and support you?
Anywhere you prefer to buy your books.
When did it come out?
It came out 2 years ago, but it's still doing well. I'm glad it has a life of its own. Here's a little secret: unless you are a multiple New York Times bestselling author, you'll never make any money on a book. So don't anybody think, have a fantasy. I'm actually in debt to my publisher, but anyway, all that to say, I'm really glad the book continues to have a life of its own, and I'm always humbled when people write me and tell me that they found it meaningful.
Costly grace.
Yeah.
Reverend Barry W. Lynn, just amazing. Thank you. Why don't you wrap up the interview, and I'll say goodnight to you. And
all right. Listen, Rob, why don't you give your website, because it's got all kinds of wonderful writings, explorations, discussions of why you are still an evangelical, and tell us your website.
Yeah, it's real simple. It's just Rev Shank, my last name.
Rev
Is
Shank.
the Hungarian and Dutch spelling, not the German, SCHENCK. So
Okay.
Rev Shank, REVSCHENCK.com, RevShank.com.
Terrific. Thanks so much for doing this.
thank you.
And we will leave you now, and we will see you, David. I will see you next week.
Yes. And unlike Reverend Bob Shank, I'm not apologizing for what I've said over the years. And
Absolutely.
No, thank you.
No,
Thank you.
certainly. Okay, doc.
Stay out of trouble, Reverend.
Only good trouble.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bob Shank.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Reverend Barry W. And very, I'm kind of speechless as I'll bring in the professors in a second. The thing that makes me proud to be a human and an American is our capacity to change. Pee Wee Reese, I always think of Pee Wee Reese, who played for the Brooklyn Dodgers, who did not want Jackie Robinson to join the team. And he protested and used the N-word and had nothing to do with Jackie Robinson. Bad guy, Pee Wee Reese, until he saw Jackie Robinson play. And then there was a complete 180. And I always think that's the most beautiful thing about humans, that we can see that we can change completely. And I think we all hold ideas that are wrong, and letting go of wrong ideas is the height of humanity. We all are born pure. Some might disagree, but then we are taught horrible things with the best intentions. And to learn to change, to let go of what's wrong is the height of humanity, in my estimation. And there's a 60 Minutes episode that I've never forgotten. They went back to a high school. I was bused in the 70s. And in the early 70s, there was a famous busing story from the South where white kids were bused to a black school. And it did not go well. There were fights in the gym. They had to shut the school down. It was a semi-famous story, a very turbulent year at this high school where they were trying to mix black students with white students in the South. 60 Minutes went back to that same school, I think 30 years later, and they brought all the kids in. And the white kids, or at least the ones who showed up for the interviews, and they had pictures of them throwing rocks at the black kids. Every kid who vociferously protested going to school with black kids, every kid, there were pictures of them protesting, had changed their mind. And it was, I know they caused damage to those black kids, but the fact that they could apologize and know that they had done harm and seek and apologize and ask for forgiveness was one of the most beautiful episodes of 60 Minutes I've ever seen. And I think all of us have wrong ideas. And as we get older, to let go of bad thoughts, bad ideas is the height of humanity. So I really have tremendous respect for you, Reverend Bob Shenk, and I hope you come back and continue this conversation with Reverend Barry W. Lynn. This was a beautiful interview. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.